All right, let's build some bridges to Central Europe. And we're going to talk about, specifically, we're going to talk about Alpine Europe. And then we'll also talk about Iberian Europe, which is in the west of Europe. But this is an exciting portion of our unit because when you want to know the identity of something, it's often very important to look at the center of it. In some ways, the center of a nation or a continent can be like its average. Now, that's not fair to all the different types of people and different geographical features that are in a country or a continent, but it's important to have some rule of thumb when you're thinking about what is Europe. So, without any further delay, let's talk about Alpine and Iberian Europe. To begin with, we're going to talk about two countries that are very similar, but they do have distinct differences as well. The first country we'll discuss is Austria, Österreich, as they say in German. And right there, you know that there is a connection between Austria and Germany. This is very true, especially before World War I and after World War II. I think you see the common ground between Germany and Austria. Now, during World War I, Austria was the center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We're going to discuss that a little bit too, and that's one of the main reasons that we're learning about Europe and its geography. Even though it's very important to world history, we're learning about it because we're going to move in future units to talk about World War I and World War II, and those wars really began essentially in Europe. So, Austria, Österreich. Reich, first of all, is kingdom. And this is a word that, we have the word rich, which is very similar to Reich. And so you see that people who are rulers are often rich, in fact, most of the time. And so a Reich is a kingdom, and that's a part of Austria's official name, the name that it calls itself. But Austria is what we call it in English. Austria is dominated by mountains, and the Alps, just like in France, the Alps are the dominant mountain range. This is the center of Europe, and so don't forget that the Alps are the center of Europe, just like the Himalayas are the center of Asia. And we also, in Austria, you have the Western Carpathian Mountains, and the Carpathian Mountains are not as high as the Alps, but they are dramatic and wild. And they are basically the mountains that sprawl from Western Europe into Eastern Europe and into the countries that we've grown to understand a little bit better since the fall of the Soviet Union. We understand Romania and Czechia and Slovakia and places like that. And you should know that the Carpathian Mountains are, again, very wild mountains. There are many wild animal populations, wolves, black bears, lynxes. And so it's a rich area in terms of nature, but also in terms of folklore and even literature. Romania is where Transylvania is, and that, of course, is where Dracula was supposedly living in the famous novel. So you have the Alps and the Carpathians, and that doesn't leave lots of room for other things in the country. Remember, mountains are not the best place to farm. And so in the eastern part of the country, you do have most of the population of Austria, and you have some farmland. And so farming is, it's not as dominant as in the Low Countries or in Germany or France, but it's still a big part of the Austrian economy. The capital city is Vienna. It's a city of culture, a city of music, and we also need to know Salzburg, which is the home for Mozart. but Mozart is, connected to Vienna as well. So is Sigmund Freud. If you remember back in our discussion of the fin de siècle, the turn of the century, Sigmund Freud was the father of psychology and understanding what goes on in people's minds. And he is famous for being from Vienna. One thing we need to mention is that Hitler actually was from Vienna as well. And you can understand that Hitler, with his German identity, he would want to bring Germany and Austria together. And so there's some interesting things that we can talk about related to that relationship. So the German language is the dominant language, the official language in Austria, just as it is in Germany. And the German culture ties Germany and Austria together. But Austria is also known for its winter sports, and pretty much downhill skiing is dominated by Austrians, both women and men. And my favorite Austrian downhill skier is Franz Klammer. Franz Klammer just sounds like the kind of person who would be ready to jump off a mountain and ski down it, right? And so winter sports, Austria dominates winter sports because of their mountainous countryside. And finally, we come to the fact that Austria, while it has a close relationship with Germany, it also has a close tie with Hungary. And the Danube River is what connects the two. So the Danube River flows through Vienna, and then it flows into Hungary. The Danube River, again, in folklore and literature, it's seen as a mystical river. We mentioned that earlier when we talked about Europe. And so Austria and Hungary are right next to each other, and they are connected but different. Hungary has the Hungarian culture, and it's again, they pride themselves on being independent from the dominant Germanic cultures of Germany and Austria. But when there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the famous Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his royal family before him, they controlled Hungary. Hungary was basically just an appendage or an arm of Austria. And that's true for many empires around the world. Now, one thing, as I said, Hitler was born in Vienna and is connected to Austria. And he sought almost immediately, once he was gaining power, he sought to bring Austria together with Germany. And that's what happened in 1938. Austria was basically annexed. They were taken over by Germany, and nobody did anything about it, including the Austrian people. And that's where we get the Sound of Music story, if you know that story. And that's why Salzburg is again, something you may know, because that's where the Sound of Music happened, and it was filmed there. So there is a legacy of Hitler in Austria. And recently, in the past 20 years, we've seen the resurgence of nationalism, which also has taken a right-wing form. Right-wing means very much wanting to promote the Austrian people as a nation and anybody who's different. So those Turkish guest workers, any immigrants from the Middle East, those people would be seen as different and would be pushed out or not treated the same. And so that kind of prejudice, racism, it's the same thing that created the Holocaust, and we need to be very wary when that starts to happen again. And so there is a right-wing party right now that has gained power in 2018 as I'm speaking. They have risen and fallen over the past 20 years, but it's always there. In every country, you have conservative movements and more liberal or progressive movements. This is true about the United States as well, when we have Republicans and Democrats. Now, it's very different in Europe, and there's a history of socialism, which is close to communism. It's more government control, lots of high taxes. But conservative political groups often want to promote a certain identity of the country, and they don't want to lose it. This might be a Christian identity, and so you see right-wing groups, political groups in Europe, in Austria, in Germany, in other countries like Poland. They want to maintain their Christian identity, especially when you have immigrants who are coming in who don't believe the same religions. And so this is important to understand, that Austria is it's a gateway to the east, because you have Hungary and all those other groups of people, the Slavic peoples to the east. And it has often been seen as kind of the defender of a certain culture or way of life over the centuries back to the Middle Ages. And so we need to understand that Austria, it's a complex place. It's changing, and we need to pay attention, because the same things that are happening there with regard to politics can happen in our own country. So that's Austria. Now, as we look at the second country, Switzerland, you're going to see similarities, and I hope you also see some subtle differences. Like Austria, Switzerland is dominated by the Alps, and it's extremely mountainous. It's 60% mountains, and that obviously means that its resources, its land resources are going to be fewer, and because it's smaller than Austria, its resources are less in general. And even though, like Austria, it's very mountainous, it has a different linguistic and cultural makeup. We can talk about the Swiss as being a certain group of people. In fact, my ancestry on my mother's side and my mother's mother's side is Swiss. But bottom line, they spoke German. They had a Swiss culture, but it was determined very much by the larger group of people nearby. Their culture was. And so the languages in Switzerland are diverse, because Switzerland is small and is bordered by those other larger countries. So in Switzerland, you have a French-speaking section, a German-speaking section, an Italian-speaking section. And so those are the three main languages, along with Romansh. And that's, again, it's a kind of a minority language. And if you think about it, you understand that people in Switzerland wouldn't have been able to join together to have a uniform culture in the same way that a big place like France could, because there wasn't the same mountainous terrain to separate groups of people. This is true all over the world. It's true also in Africa, where you have groups of people who are separated because of geographical features, and they start to develop their own culture. So Switzerland, what is it known for? Well, let's start with the capital. I should mention that the Jura or Jura Mountains are also a part of the terrain in Switzerland. So it's kind of a lesser mountain range. But the capital of Switzerland is Bern. And Bern is known for a bear pit that is in the center of the city. And I remember going there and being kind of surprised. And I understand now it's connected to the name of the city, and it's a symbol of pride. It's also a little bit sad when you see this pit with bears in it. Fortunately, people are generally kind to the bears. It's like a zoo in the middle of the city. So you have Bern, and you also have a couple of other cities. You have Zurich, which is known for its banking, and Switzerland in general has the reputation as a banking nation. We'll come back to that in a second. Then you have Geneva, which is an international center. Geneva is a place where many international meetings are held. It's on Lake Geneva, so that's a geographical feature that we've mentioned earlier. But Geneva is a very international city, and one half of the people who live in Geneva are not even from Switzerland. So that's an interesting reality. for Geneva. You also have Lucerne, which is another famous place, a picturesque city in Switzerland, and all of these are tourist attractions. So if you go to Switzerland, what are you going to find them selling to you? As you can imagine, the Swiss, they sell cheese and chocolate. Why? Well, it comes, again, from their mountainous terrain. Even though they don't grow a lot of agricultural products, they do have cows and they make dairy products. But because it's so difficult to get those milk products, dairy products to market because of the winding mountainous roads, instead, they use those dairy products to make chocolate and to make cheese. Very practical. You also have timepieces. Switzerland is known for its precision making of clocks and watches and also medical instruments. So you have timepieces and you have treats. Those are the things you'll find in a duty-free shop that's related to Switzerland. Now, Switzerland has, because of its mountainous terrain and its central location, amazingly, it has avoided the wars of the 20th century, and it has maintained neutrality. And so it has not been destroyed over the course of those wars. And Austria, too, was neutral during the Cold War. So after World War II and siding with Hitler, Austria has been neutral. And it's always interesting to look at that and see which countries in Europe did not just go along with the others, one side or the other, the communist side or the democratic side, capitalist side. And speaking of capitalism, Switzerland is known for its banking. As we said, Zurich is known for its banking. Because it has this unique status, being neutral, it also has a status of anonymity. So people often put money in Swiss bank accounts, and their identity is only known to the bank, and it's difficult to find out who the owner of bank accounts is. Unfortunately, this means that dictators and corrupt people around the world have often put money into Swiss bank accounts to keep the government officials and police from finding their money. So that's Switzerland, a very interesting country, even though a small country. And you can see some similarities and differences between it and Austria. Let's talk now about Italy. There's so much to say about Italy. Italy was the center of the largest empire that covered the European continent, the Roman Empire. And so sometimes when we say Italy, we immediately think of Rome. The reality is that Italy has not been a nation very long, only 150 years. Now, the United States hasn't been a nation for that much longer, but to think of Italy as being this ancient people and country, it's only been a country recently. And before that, it was broken into city-states. And so you had Genoa, and you even had the island of Sicily, and you had Rome and Naples and Venice and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we will talk about some of those major cities. You should know that the geographical features most prominent in Italy are the mountains. It's very mountainous, like Austria, like Switzerland. And the mountain ranges kind of form a T. And so this cross of the T, or a cross, because again, we remember that Rome is the center of Christianity. So the top of the cross is the Alps, and they run east to west across the top of Italy, dividing it from Switzerland. And then the other mountain range is the Apennines, and that runs along the spine or the backbone of Italy. And so that's important to understand. Italy is also is comprised of two islands, Sardinia, and Sicily. So Sardinia is just to the south of Corsica. Remember, Corsica is owned or controlled by France, and Sardinia is controlled by Italy. And they're very close to each other. So you can imagine over the centuries there have been some conflicts. Sicily then is the football that's being kicked by Italy, and basically creates almost a land bridge between the European continent and Africa. And back in the time of the Romans, you had Rome, and then you had Sicily in the middle, and then you had Carthage just to the south. And Carthage was, again, a rival with Rome and could have taken over the world if it had won the Punic Wars, which were fought between Rome and Carthage. Carthage must be destroyed, right? That's the famous saying. So cities in Italy that you need to know, because Italy really began as city-states. We have Venice, which was formed among all those islands, and that's on the northwest coast of Italy. And you have Florence, which is more central in northern Italy, and that's the birthplace of the Renaissance. By the way, Venice has all those canals that you probably know about, and you don't need a car, and it's very small, and so you can walk around or take the gondolas, which are the boats that take you through the canals of Venice. And again, Florence is known for its art and architecture from the Renaissance. You have Rome, which obviously has all the Roman history, but also has a lot of other history to it because it was a political center, and it is where the Vatican has been housed. So Rome is the center of Roman Catholicism, and earlier was the center of Christianity. So you have Rome, you also have Milan, and you have Naples, which is on basically the southwest coast, and just across from Naples you have the island of Capri, which is a famous tourist destination. But Naples is also the location of a famous volcano named Vesuvius, and the city town of Pompeii was destroyed when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Finally, you have Turin. So the four most populous cities in Italy are Rome, Milan, Naples, and Turin, and they all have more than 1 million people living in them. Finally, Vatican City is so unique because it's a country within a country. The Vatican is its own sovereign state and has its own guards or army. And the interesting thing is those who defend or guard the Pope, who lives in Vatican City, and the cardinals and other people who are in charge of that small state. The guards are from Switzerland. They are the Swiss guards. Now, again, that's very interesting because Switzerland is neutral, and they haven't had a big army. So this goes back centuries and centuries. It used to be that the Vatican or the Pope actually controlled chunks of Italy, and those states were called the Papal States. They belonged to the Pope. And in history, many times the Pope was a landowner and controlled big chunks of Italy. So if you want to go to Vatican City, just remember you will be going to the Vatican and you'll be seeing the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's paintings of God and Adam and all of creation and the Bible scenes. And there's just so much there that you really need to go more than once. And so you also have the famous Pietà, which is a statue of the Virgin Mary holding Jesus after he had died. And it's a very beautiful and moving piece of art. So there's so much to see in art in Rome and Italy. Remember that the Tiber River is that river that flows through Rome. And you also have 7 hills in Rome that give it its unique trademark. All right. Now let's move from the mountainous central regions of Europe to the coast, and we're gonna move again to that Iberian Peninsula, which is to the southwest of France. And it's divided from France by the Pyrenees Mountains, the Pyrenees. And the peninsula is home to two countries, two of the oldest countries in Europe, Portugal and Spain. And Portugal is one of the smallest nations in Europe. But Portugal is a tiny part on the Mediterranean side of, the Atlantic side of the Iberian Peninsula. And so it had a long coastline, and that coastline led to exploration by sea. It didn't have a lot of land to farm for itself, so logically it sought out colonies, it sought out other resources elsewhere. And for a time, Portugal ruled the world in the 1400s. We call the 1400s the golden century of Portugal. And the capital is Lisbon, very ancient city, and it is, again, a center of commerce in that country. The country, like Spain, is Roman Catholic primarily, and so the Iberian Peninsula, along with Italy, those are, and France, more or less, those areas remained Catholic even through the Reformation. Again, it's a tiny nation, but has had enormous influence in world history. And what you do need to know is that recently, in the 2010s, Portugal started experiencing what in the United States we call the Great Recession. And the Great Recession was a downturn in the U.S. economy in 2008, the end of 2007, the beginning of 2008. So we think of it as 2008. And the effects of that Great Recession were felt all over the world. And Portugal and Greece and Ireland suffered the most. They were all economies based on banking and financial dealings. And when the banks started to go into problem areas, Portugal had too much debt. And so they had to get help from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And they had to get help. And to do that, those organizations required Portugal to have what we call austerity measures. And that means that they reduced their budget and they made people take pay cuts in order to save the economy. And they've done, honestly, an incredible job. And Portugal has recovered, and their growth of their economy was pretty good this past year, similar to the United States in terms of percentage. So that's a success story that came out of the Great Recession. Finally, we need to talk about Spain. Again, so much can be said of Spain. The golden century of Spain was the 1500s, and Spain was one of the earliest countries, nations in Europe. It goes back to Ferdinand and Isabella and what they called the Reconquista, which was the reconquering of Spain from the Muslim Moors. The Moorish peoples had basically come from the south, from Africa, from Morocco, for example, and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and settled in Cordoba. In many places, Cordoba is a major Muslim-influenced city and in Spain. And so there's a strong Muslim influence in Spain, even though all of those Muslims and Jewish people as well were driven out by Ferdinand and Isabella. And remember, Ferdinand and Isabella were the ones who sent Columbus on his voyages to the New World. The capital of, again, it's the Iberian Peninsula is separated by the Pyrenees Mountains, divides France from Spain and Portugal. And Madrid is the capital of Spain, and there are numerous museums in Spain. Again, the culture of Spain goes back centuries and centuries, and you may see paintings. If you go to the Prado Museum in Madrid, you'll see paintings by El Greco and by Goya and Velázquez. Those are the three big painters that Spain brags about to this day, along with Picasso. The economy in Spain is growing and industrializing rapidly, and because the wages are less in Spain, the European Union has used Spain to create industry, and so that does show that things are looking up for Spain as the economy industrializes more and more and moves from an agricultural economy, which it had in the early part of the 20th century. Again, there are Muslim influences, but there also are Roman influences in Spain too. And you have aqueducts and you have Roman ruins in Spain to show just how far the Roman Empire had spread. One thing that's interesting to note is that Spain, even though it is this oldest nation of Europe, it is also a place of disagreement. The Basque movement is a separatist movement. The Basque people have their own language and they have their own identity, and they want to break away from Spain, and there have been some terrorist attacks as a result of that to try and get the Spanish government to let go of the Basque area. And also Catalonia, where the people speak Catalan, that area has recently tried to break away from Spain. In fact, the governor of Catalonia was trying to say that they were an independent country, and it didn't work out. The Spanish were able to reassert their authority. But that is important, that even in a fairly united country, you can still have little movements that are trying to break away. So we have diversity. We have all these different languages and peoples and religions, and it is significant that these countries have still held together after decades and decades. We'll see how that goes over the coming decades.